Hey yo, what up gamers? Coming at you with some more book review content. I got a hold of both of Quentin Tarantino's novels. Quentin Tarantino is one of my favorite directors of all time. And you may not know this, but he actually has recently started making novels. And I wanted to check these out because pretty soon he may be done making movies. He claims he's going to only make 10 movies. I don't really know how true the whole 10 movies thing is. I saw him on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about it, and it sounded like he might still make movies. He's just not going to take them as seriously as these kind of core 10. But if he does indeed stop making movies, then, novels are going to be his next art form, I'm assuming. And this is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's a novelization of the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You can tell this is written by Quentin Tarantino because it has a pair of women's bare feet on the cover. The original cover was actually even more horny than this one. This artwork is, of course, a reference to an iconic scene from the movie where Brad Pitt is driving one of the Charles Manson hippies to the Spahn Ranch. You can see the Spahn Ranch here, and you can see Brad Pitt's reflection in the rearview mirror. There's actually a lot more feet content in the book than there was in the movie, which is pretty astounding. Tarantino really catering to his fan base. But yeah, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I thought it was one of his weaker films when I saw it in the theater. The more I rewatch it, the more it grows on me. And the novel I actually enjoyed even more than the movie. I think it actually kind of enhances the movie. I would strongly recommend watching the movie first because the novelization kind of jumps around the timeline a lot. Tarantino does a lot of his signature non-linear storytelling in this one, a la Pulp Fiction. After the first few chapters, I was a little skeptical of the book. I was like, this is basically just the same as the movie, just written down. But then the book really started to pick up after maybe chapter 4 or 5. And I realized that the book actually really expands on the movie. We get a lot more backstory, especially of Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character. One of my favorite bits in here is the story of how he got his dog, Brandy, who's the iconic dog from the movie that eats the hippie's face off. There's a really good chapter about how he got that dog that could be its own book. I mean, it's that in-depth. The book also expands on a lot of scenes in the movie that kind of didn't really have that much significance, that you realize in the book why these scenes were so significant. There's a scene in the movie where Sharon Tate, played by Margot Robbie, goes to the theater to watch one of her own movies. When I saw it in the movie, I was thinking, why is this scene necessary at all? Other than to showcase Margot Robbie's feet. The scene doesn't really add much of anything, but in the book it makes a lot more sense. This is one of Sharon's first times doing slapstick comedy in a movie, and she was really nervous for what the reaction would be. So she went to the theater to kind of experience how the audience would react. The scene actually has a lot of depth to it, and I quite enjoyed it. The book also expands a lot more on the Charles Manson related stuff. In the movie, Manson really is just like a brief cameo. He doesn't play that big of a role. The movie kind of expects you to know the history of Charles Manson, and doesn't really kind of expand much on that. Whereas the book, you actually learn a lot more about Charles Manson and his kind of failed music career of associating with one of the artists from the Beach Boys, living in his house, how he had this whole harem of women that he would manipulate. It was actually a lot more interesting. This character, the kind of underage girl that Brad Pitt drives around in that one scene, her character is a lot more expanded in the book. We see her background with Charlie. We kind of understand a lot more about how Charles Manson manipulates these women and what's going through these girls' heads. As someone who didn't really know that much about the Manson family and all that, it was actually pretty interesting to learn all this history about him being involved in the music industry and all this stuff. It was pretty fun to read. The book also expands a lot more on the pilot that Rick Dalton is shooting, where he's playing that character, Caleb Decatur, with the big mustache. We get a lot more of the actual story of that pilot that they were shooting, and it's actually a pretty interesting, in-depth story. There's a few chapters that actually take place in the universe of that TV show, and we kind of experience it from the character's perspective. The main character, Johnny Madrid, is very conflicted about his father. He kind of hates his father for abandoning him and his mother. He blames his dad for his mother, becoming a prostitute. He plans to go and murder his dad, but over the course of the episode, he grows more and more of a bond with his father. It was actually pretty interesting to read, and the book ends on, at the final moment of the pilot that we don't actually get to see in the movie. I really quite enjoyed the story. The book also fleshes out a lot more the relationship between Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Rick Dalton, and the child actor. They have a kind of a touching conversation at the end, practicing their lines. About 5 or 6 chapters in, you really see the non-linear aspects of the book. Up until that point, the book is pretty straightforward, very similar to the movie, goes through a kind of this linear story. And then around chapter 6, they cut way forward in the timeline, after the actual end of the movie when he kills all the Manson family people. The whole killing of the hippies at the end is kind of just told in a flashback, basically. He basically just tells his neighbor, yeah, we killed these hippies and burned them. It's a lot less in-depth than the movie version. It definitely feels like you're supposed to have seen the movie to really understand what the characters are talking about. So that's why I would recommend watching the movie first. But yeah, I thought it was a pretty bold decision to do the story like that, where it's told in a completely different order. Whereas in the movie, that's like the climax moment, like the holy shit moment. In the book, that's not really the climax at all. It's completely different. I feel like it makes the book kind of justify its existence because it feels a lot different than the movie, even though a lot of the story is the same. Overall, I just thoroughly enjoyed this book. Would highly recommend it for Quentin Tarantino fans. This is probably the best book I've read since I read the Song of Ice and Fire series, the first kind of book series that got me back into reading. Ever since I read the Song of Ice and Fire series to start getting back into reading, I feel like every other book I read just feels kind of lackluster in comparison to that. But this is the first book where I really got into it, as much as I did with A Song of Ice and Fire. The only gripe I really have with the book is that Tarantino really expects you to know so much about Hollywood at this period of time. He'll just list so many actors and so many movies and kind of just expect you to know them. There's many times where they're just pages and pages of just references to movies that I've never heard of, actors I haven't heard of. I think in chapter 2, it's the first chapter with Cliff as one of the POV characters. And they go through every movie he's seen basically, and it's just oh yeah, Cliff really loved this and this and this actor and this actor and this actor, and he worked with this person and this person and this person, and it's I don't know any of this stuff, but there's a lot of points like that where Tarantino really kind of almost seems like he's writing a book for himself at some points with how much references to Hollywood there is. It can be a bit overwhelming. That's pretty much the only gripe I have with the book. Now moving on to Tarantino's next book, Cinema Speculation. This is a nonfiction book, and it basically is Tarantino going through movies in the 70s, a lot of movies that have stood out to him. He gives a lot of insight into Hollywood in the 70s that was pretty interesting to me, not knowing much about cinema in the 70s. I hadn't seen almost any of the movies he talks about in this book except Taxi Driver, but he goes into such detail that I feel like I've seen them. One thing I really liked is he not only reviews, his opinion of the movie, but he also goes into some of the history of each movie and the things going on at the time, politics going on at the time, and why the movie resonated with a lot of people. He goes into a movie called Dirty Harry and why at the time that resonated with a lot of older audiences, but a lot of younger audiences thought the movie was evil and fascist. Gives you a good understanding of the opinions people had about the movie at the time and how things have changed over time. He also goes into how a lot of these movies could have been a lot different and maybe even better. He goes into how producers would kind of force writers and directors to put certain things into the movie to make them less controversial, specifically with a lot of Paul Schrader's scripts. Paul Schrader was the guy who wrote Taxi Driver and many other critically acclaimed films. Quentin breaks down how there's a minor change in the film Taxi Driver where at the end when he shoots the pimps and all these people running this whorehouse, in the script all these individuals are black. It kind of gives the audience the feeling of, oh my god, did Travis do this for the right reasons, or is he just doing this because he has racist tendencies? Scorsese has said that the ending of Taxi Driver is meant to, at first, be kind of a catharsis for the viewer, being on Travis's side and wanting him to save this child prostitute. But then after they stew on it for a bit, they realize that Travis didn't really do it for the right reasons and that this was just kind of a murderous fantasy that he wanted to do. But Quentin points out that if they had the characters actually remain black like in the script, this theme would have been sent home a lot more. Whereas, with the movie out now, a lot of people just kind of are on Travis's side at the end. They don't really have this feeling that what Travis did was wrong. It was just kind of interesting to see Quentin's perspective on how, minor changes to certain scripts completely flip how the movie is seen. Just a seemingly minor change, like changing the race of one character, completely changes how people view the movie. I also liked in here, in a few of the chapters, we get a good glimpse into Quentin at the time. He talks about, being like 9, 10 years old and going to see these very, adult movies, very complex, deep movies. He had a very kind of sophisticated taste in movies from a very young age, and it was pretty funny to see. His mother kind of respected his intelligence and recognized that he was mature enough to see some of these more adult films and would take him out to these movies. He dedicates the last chapter to this individual named Floyd, who was this male figure in Quentin's life, this older black gentleman that rented space in his mother's house or something. He was one of the only people in Quentin's life that had the same appreciation for film that Quentin did. And you really see how this person kind of shaped Quentin into the man that he is. Quentin shows how this Floyd guy was, a very flawed character, but he had a lot of, wisdom to impart on Quentin. I thought it was a pretty touching way to end the book. One thing that's kind of strange about the book is there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to the movies that Quentin is picking. At first, I thought he was just going through all the movies in the 70s and like picking out one from each year that he liked the best. But some of the movies in here he doesn't even really like. Some of the movies in here he kind of trashes. He never really explains why he specifically chose to pick these movies that he addresses in here. And there's a few that he doesn't address that I was kind of disappointed about. He talks a little bit in here about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and how he thinks that's a perfect film. But then he says, to avoid just gushing about Chainsaw Massacre for 100 pages, let's talk about this other movie. And I was kind of disappointed. I wanted to hear him talk more about Chainsaw Massacre. I assume he thought that everything that could be said about the Chainsaw Massacre has already been said, and maybe he wanted to focus on movies that people haven't really given much criticism about. Also, the title of the book, Cinema Speculation, he doesn't really do as much speculation as the title would suggest. There's only really one chapter entitled Cinema Speculation where he actually kind of goes into certain movies that could have been and theorizing, if this person directed this movie, how would this have looked? He gives an explanation of what he thinks Taxi Driver would look like had Brian De Palma directed it and not Martin Scorsese. I wish he did some more of this. It was pretty interesting. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. He gives a lot of insight into 70s film, a lot of good critiques on film. I really like this insight into Quentin's mind. He seems like a very interesting person. I hope we get some more books where he goes more in depth. And yeah, I'm excited to see Quentin Tarantino's final film, what books he writes next. And peace, gamers.